Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, on a low hill that shepherds have been walking across for thousands of years, there is a building that was already ancient when the first stone of the Great Pyramid was laid. It is older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than metal tools, older than pottery. When the people who built it were carving 20-foot pillars out of solid limestone and dragging them across the landscape, the rest of humanity was, according to every textbook printed before the 1990s, still living in caves as scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who had barely figured out how to make a decent basket. The building shouldn't exist. Not this early, not at this scale, not built by the kind of people that the traditional timeline of civilization insists were incapable of building anything, and yet it does exist. Archaeologists have been digging into it since 1994. In 30 years of work, they have uncovered maybe 10% of it. What they have uncovered has forced the rewriting of textbooks that took a century to establish. It has upended the accepted story of how civilization actually began, in what order, and for what reason. Its name is Göbekli Tepe. And the deeper researchers dig into it, the more the version of human history you learned in school starts to look less like established science and more like a comfortable guess that just got exposed. To understand why Göbekli Tepe rewrote human history, you first have to understand the story it rewrote, the one that stood in every textbook, museum plaque, and classroom lecture for the better part of 100 years. Because the accepted version of how civilization began was so tidy, so intuitive, so widely agreed upon, that for decades almost nobody thought to question it. The traditional story goes like this. For most of human existence, roughly 300,000 years, according to modern estimates of our species, people lived as small mobile groups of hunter-gatherers. They followed animal migrations. They picked wild plants. They slept in temporary shelters and moved on when the seasons shifted or the food ran out. This is, statistically, how nearly all humans who have ever lived actually lived, and by any measure, it worked. It kept our species alive across ice ages, migrations across continents, and every environmental catastrophe the planet threw at us for the vast majority of our history. Then somewhere around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, according to the textbook version, something changed. Somebody, somewhere, figured out that if you took the seeds of certain wild grasses and planted them deliberately in the ground, you could produce food in one location instead of walking hundreds of miles to gather it. Agriculture was born. And once agriculture existed, everything else followed in a specific, logical, textbook-friendly order. Because farming required you to stay near your fields, you couldn't wander off for 6 months and come back expecting your wheat to be exactly where you left it. People built permanent settlements. Because permanent settlements produced more food than a family needed, some people were freed from farming to do other things. They became potters, weavers, metal workers, priests. As populations grew and communities became more complex, specialists emerged, hierarchies formed, and eventually you got kings, temples, writing, cities, empires. The cascade from that one initial breakthrough, planting seeds, was supposed to have taken thousands of years to unfold, each step logically depending on the one before it. Agriculture came first. Everything else, monuments, religion, organized society, cities, came after. That was the story. It was so widely accepted that generations of archaeologists building their careers on it never seriously questioned the sequence, only the specific details. Whether farming was invented once and spread outward, or invented independently in multiple places. Whether it happened first in the Fertile Crescent, in China, in the Americas, whether the shift took 500 years or 2,000. But the fundamental order was never in dispute. Agriculture, then settlement, then complexity, then monuments. First you eat, then you build. Göbekli Tepe broke that entire sequence. Here's what actually sits on that hill in southeastern Turkey. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, some more than 5 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 15 tons apiece. Arranged in circular enclosures, some containing as many as 12 pillars each. Carved with intricate, high-relief images of animals. Foxes, wild boars, cranes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, lions. Some of the pillars have arms carved onto them, with hands folded across what would be a stomach. They are, most researchers now believe, stylized representations of human beings, abstract stone bodies looming over whoever gathered inside the enclosures. The stones are limestone, quarried from the surrounding bedrock. Some of them were transported nearly 500 meters from where they were cut. Moving a 15-ton piece of limestone half a kilometer across uneven terrain without wheels, without draft animals, requires a significant number of coordinated human beings pulling on ropes and rolling stones over logs, taking days or weeks per stone, working under the direction of someone who understands both engineering and logistics. Radiocarbon dating of organic material embedded in the site places the oldest structures at approximately 9,600 to 9,500 BC. That is roughly 11,500 to 11,600 years ago, 7,000 years before the pyramids at Giza, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years before there is any clear archaeological evidence of agriculture anywhere on Earth. And that last number is the one that broke the textbook. Because the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They could not have been. Farming didn't exist yet, which means the story of who built civilization and why is not the one anyone taught you. The man who first understood what he was looking at was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, and the story of how he got there is worth telling because it says something about how easily an entire species can walk past its own history without noticing. The hill itself had been on archaeological maps since the 1960s. American researchers from the University of Chicago surveyed it in 1963 as part of a broader project cataloging prehistoric sites across southeastern Anatolia. They found stone tools scattered across the surface. They noted the presence of what appeared to be limestone slabs poking through the soil. They concluded that the site was probably a medieval cemetery, made a few notes, and moved on. The limestone slabs, they assumed, were broken grave markers. For 30 years, nobody went back. The hill sat on the survey list, gathering dust. Local farmers in the region continued using it the way they had for generations, grazing sheep across it, occasionally hitting stone with their plows, and cursing whoever had left rocks in a field. If any of them noticed that some of the buried stones were massive, or that they seemed to have carvings on them, they didn't consider it particularly interesting. The Şanlıurfa region of Turkey is dense with old ruins. One more pile of stones was not news. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt read the 1963 survey notes while looking for a new dig site. Something about the descriptions caught his attention, specifically the limestone slabs, which the American survey had dismissed as grave markers, but which Schmidt suspected might be something else. He drove out to the hill to look for himself. Within minutes of walking the surface, he understood he was looking at something that had no business existing. The stones were not grave markers. They were the exposed tops of enormous pillars, buried up to their necks in accumulated soil. And they were carved. Even the fragments visible on the surface showed clear evidence of high-relief animal imagery. The kind of skilled stone carving that by every accepted timeline of when humans developed that capability should not have been present anywhere on Earth this long ago. Schmidt began excavating the following year. What emerged from the ground over the next 2 decades reshaped his career and reshaped archaeology. The site sits on top of a hill called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly from Turkish as Potbelly Hill, a reference to the mound's distinctive rounded shape rising above the surrounding plain. That mound, as it turned out, was not natural. It was made of the accumulated debris of thousands of years of construction, use, and eventually deliberate burial, all sitting on top of an original bedrock foundation that the builders had carved into to anchor their pillars. The first enclosure Schmidt uncovered, designated Enclosure D, contained 12 T-shaped pillars arranged in a rough circle, with 2 additional pillars standing in the center. The central pillars were larger than the others and clearly represented human figures. Arms carved down their sides, belts around their waists, hands folded across their stomachs, fox pelt garments hanging from the belts in high relief. The peripheral pillars were carved with animals, a fox running along one side, a snake winding down another, a wild boar snarling from a third. Each pillar different from the last, each carrying its own combination of imagery. The workmanship was extraordinary, not the crude scratching a first-year sculptor might produce. These carvings showed proportion, anatomical accuracy, and stylistic consistency that implied trained artists working within a shared tradition. Somebody, in other words, had taught them how to do this, which meant the tradition of sophisticated stone carving already existed before Göbekli Tepe was built. And Enclosure D was only the beginning. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted later revealed that the entire hill contained at least 20 additional enclosures still buried beneath the surface. 20 more circular structures, hundreds more pillars, almost none of it excavated. When Schmidt described the site to colleagues, the numbers were so large that some of them assumed he must be exaggerating. He wasn't. 30 years into the excavation, roughly 10% of Göbekli Tepe has been uncovered. The other 90% is still under the ground. The question that consumed Schmidt for the rest of his life. He died in 2014, before the full implications of his own discovery had been worked out, was the same question that consumes the researchers who inherited his work. Why? Why did people who did not yet farm, who did not yet live in permanent villages, who did not yet have writing or metal or the wheel, decide to spend generations building something like this in the middle of nowhere? The answer, when it started to emerge, was stranger than anyone had expected. The answer that emerged, over years of careful excavation and cross-referencing with other sites in the region, was one that no archaeologist trained in the 20th century had been prepared to accept, because it required inverting the entire established sequence of how civilization began. Start with what Göbekli Tepe was clearly not. It was not a village. Excavators found no houses on the hill, no domestic structures, no permanent dwellings, no cooking hearths of the kind that would suggest people slept there regularly. There were no burials inside the enclosures themselves, at least none that have been definitively identified. The site had no obvious defensive purpose. It sat exposed on a hilltop, without walls or fortifications. Whatever it was for, it was not where the builders actually lived their day-to-day lives. What it appeared to be was a gathering place, somewhere people came to specifically from wherever they normally lived, for reasons that the traditional textbook categories didn't quite have a word for. The circular enclosures were built with stone benches along their inner walls. The central pillars, with their carved human bodies, stood facing whoever sat on those benches. The scale of the construction, moving 15-ton stones across the landscape, carving them with elaborate imagery, arranging them in geometrically precise circles, required labor forces far larger than any single hunter-gatherer band could have supplied. Estimates for a single enclosure run into the hundreds of workers, coordinated across months or years of effort, which meant something the traditional timeline could not accommodate. Groups of hunter-gatherers scattered across a wide region must have been coming together periodically at Göbekli Tepe to build it, not because they lived there, because they were choosing, collectively, to travel long distances and pool their labor into a project none of them could have completed alone. That single fact, the sheer coordination required, broke one of the load-bearing assumptions of the old model. Hunter-gatherers were supposed to be incapable of that kind of organization. Small, mobile, egalitarian bands didn't have chiefs strong enough to command hundreds of workers across a construction project spanning years. They didn't have the food surplus to feed non-farming laborers doing nothing but stonework for months at a time. The textbook version of prehistory had them barely holding together as extended family groups, let alone mustering the workforce of a small ancient city. And yet, here was Göbekli Tepe, undeniably built by exactly those kinds of people, undeniably requiring exactly that kind of coordination. The pillars did not carve themselves. The stones did not walk half a kilometer on their own. Somebody organized this, and that somebody was operating with a level of social complexity that hunter-gatherers were not supposed to possess. The other assumption Göbekli Tepe broke was the one about why people started settling down in the first place. The traditional story said agriculture came first, that once people started farming, they were forced to stay put to tend their crops, and permanent settlement followed as a practical necessity. Göbekli Tepe suggests the causality may have run in the opposite direction, because Göbekli Tepe sits in exactly the region where, within a few hundred years of its construction, the world's first evidence of deliberate agriculture appears. The einkorn wheat that would eventually become the ancestor of most modern wheat crops was first domesticated on Karaka Dağ, a mountain visible from the Göbekli Tepe hilltop, less than 50 miles away. The first domesticated cattle appear in this same region shortly after. The first domesticated pigs, the first domesticated sheep, the Fertile Crescent, and specifically the northern arc that runs through southeastern Turkey, is where the entire Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, actually began. The timing is almost too neat to be coincidence. First, hunter-gatherers start gathering periodically at Göbekli Tepe to build something enormous together. Then, within a few centuries, agriculture appears in the immediate surrounding landscape. Then permanent villages start showing up. Then everything we associate with civilization begins to unfold. Pottery, textiles, metalworking, writing, over the following few thousand years. The traditional story said agriculture caused settlement, which caused monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite, that the desire to gather at a monument may have caused settlement, which then required agriculture to feed the growing population that was choosing, for the first time in human history, to stay near a specific place for reasons that had nothing to do with food. The monument came first. Everything else followed from the need to be near it. There's a phrase archaeologists use quietly when they don't want to overstate their case in academic papers. They call Göbekli Tepe the temple that came before the town. It is a careful way of saying something that, phrased more directly, would sound almost unbelievable. That the first thing our ancestors built together, before villages, before farms, before the domestic technologies most people would consider basic survival needs, was a place to gather for something that looks, from every angle we can measure it, like religion. That word, religion, is one archaeologists use cautiously, because we don't have direct evidence of what the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually believed. There are no written records. There is no surviving mythology, no priestly texts, no scriptural fragments to work from. What there is the site itself, and the site is telling a specific story to anyone willing to read it carefully. Start with the pillars themselves. The T-shape is not incidental. It is a highly stylized human figure, viewed from a specific perspective. The horizontal top represents the head. The vertical shaft represents the body. Arms carved down the sides show hands folded across the belly. Belts appear around the waists of the largest pillars, with what look like carved fox pelts hanging from them like ceremonial garments. These are not decorative choices. They are the same choices, made in the same way, across dozens of pillars distributed across multiple enclosures. Somebody standardized this iconography. Somebody made deliberate decisions about how these abstract stone humans should look, and those decisions were then transmitted across a labor force large enough to execute them consistently over years of construction. That is the signature of a shared belief system, an organized set of ideas that mattered enough to encode into permanent stone in a form recognizable to everyone who saw it. Then there are the animals. Every enclosure at Göbekli Tepe features specific animal imagery, and the animals are not random. They are overwhelmingly dangerous ones. Snakes, scorpions, leopards, vultures, wild boars with tusks bared, foxes shown mid-lunge. These are not the animals a peaceful farming society would carve into its temples for decoration. These are the animals that killed you if you weren't careful, or the animals that fed on you after you died. The imagery reads less like celebration and more like warning. The pillars themselves face inward toward whoever sat on the benches. The animals stalk down their sides. If you were sitting inside enclosure D 12,000 years ago, watching a fire flicker between the two central pillars, you would have been surrounded by stone predators watching you back. There is also something specifically strange about the vulture imagery. On Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, a large vulture is carved with what appears to be a headless human figure below it. A separate carved circle sits above the vulture's wing. Some researchers have interpreted this scene as connected to sky burial, the practice of exposing the dead to be consumed by vultures, still practiced in some cultures today and known to have been performed at other Neolithic sites in the region, which connects to another detail. Excavators at Göbekli Tepe and at closely related sites in the region have found human skulls that were deliberately modified after death. Some had grooves carved along the top, suggesting they may have been suspended from cords. Others show evidence of having been kept, displayed, and handled by the living long after the deaths of the people they belonged to. The Neolithic peoples of this region appear to have had a specific relationship with the dead, one in which the boundary between the living and the deceased was not as clean as modern minds tend to imagine it. Sit with that for a moment, because it is worth understanding what it means. The first architecture our species built together, on the first hill we ever chose to keep coming back to, was designed around the idea that the dead were still with us, that the animals stalking through our stone circles were watching us the same way they had watched our ancestors, that whatever gathered inside those enclosures, priest, storyteller, chief, we don't know, was doing something serious enough to justify hauling 15-ton stones across the landscape by hand. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive. That word, when applied to them, is a modern insult that says more about the person using it than about the people it describes. They were, by every measurable standard, sophisticated. They organized labor at scales that shouldn't have been possible. They developed shared belief systems complex enough to require permanent monuments. They designed and executed art that would remain intelligible to us 12,000 years later. What they didn't have was our technology. That's it. That's the entire difference. And if we're honest with ourselves, that's not a difference that makes us smarter than them. It just means we came later. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. That is the sentence that changed everything. And it is the sentence most casual retellings of this story leave out entirely. For years after the initial discovery, Göbekli Tepe was treated as an anomaly, a single, spectacular, inexplicable site that had somehow emerged in isolation 12,000 years ago and then disappeared just as suddenly. The framing was tempting because it was simpler. One weird hill in Turkey, one impossible monument. Something happened there once, and then it stopped happening. Then archaeologists started looking around. Roughly 22 miles east of Göbekli Tepe, on another low hill in the same rolling landscape of southeastern Anatolia, sits a site called Karahan Tepe. It was known to exist since 1997, cataloged in regional surveys, but not seriously excavated until 2019. When Turkish archaeologists finally began digging there in earnest, what came out of the ground was almost as astonishing as Göbekli Tepe itself, and in some ways more revealing, because Karahan Tepe wasn't a copy. It was a variation on the same tradition, built by the same broader culture, roughly contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe. There are T-shaped pillars at Karahan Tepe, arranged in similar circular structures. There are carved reliefs of animals, snakes, leopards, birds. The stone carving techniques are recognizable, the iconography is related, and the scale of the construction implies the same kind of coordinated labor that Göbekli Tepe required. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe was not working alone. They were part of a wider cultural network extending across this region of southeastern Turkey, and Karahan Tepe is one node in that network. But Karahan Tepe also has features Göbekli Tepe doesn't. The most striking is a chamber carved directly into the bedrock containing 11 stone pillars that appear to be stylized phalluses, deliberately shaped fertility symbols standing upright in a room where entering visitors would have encountered them face first. At the far end of the same chamber, carved into the stone wall, is a life-size human head with sharp features, prominent lips, and what appears to be a beard. Whoever entered this space in the Neolithic was walking into something clearly ritualized and probably initiatory, a symbolic transformation of the visitor from one social status to another. Elsewhere at Karahan Tepe, Archaeologists uncovered a life-size statue of a man, standing roughly 7.5 feet tall, holding what appears to be his own phallus with both hands. It is currently considered the oldest known life-sized human sculpture ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Older than any statue in Egypt. Older than the marble figures of Cycladic Greece by 7,000 years. Older than any life-sized human representation you have ever seen in a museum. The site is still being excavated. The full extent of what remains buried there is not yet known. And Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are not the only ones. Over the past 2 decades, Turkish and international archaeologists have identified at least a dozen related sites across southeastern Anatolia: Nevala Chori, Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, Sayburç, and others. Some of them are already partially excavated. Others are still being surveyed. What is becoming clear from the accumulated evidence is that this entire region, a stretch of land roughly the size of a small European country, was home to an interconnected Neolithic culture that was building monumental architecture, carving sophisticated art, developing shared iconography, and organizing large-scale collective labor at a time when the rest of the world was still, by every accepted timeline, doing none of these things. Turkish researchers have started calling this broader cultural sphere the Taş Tepeler culture, literally the stone hills. The name refers to the fact that these sites all sit on low prominences in the landscape, deliberately chosen for visibility. Standing on top of any one of them, you can see several of the others on the horizon on a clear day. They were not hidden. They were meant to be seen from each other and by whoever was traveling through the region. Which means Göbekli Tepe was never actually the anomaly it appeared to be when Schmidt first started digging. It was one of many. It was, at most, the most impressive example of a broader tradition that had already been unfolding across this landscape for centuries by the time Enclosure D was carved out of the bedrock. And that changes the question. It stops being, how did one weird site emerge in the middle of nowhere 12,000 years ago, and becomes something considerably harder to dismiss. An entire civilization, or something very close to one, was already operating in southeastern Turkey before the accepted history of civilization is supposed to have begun. It left behind monuments, art, ritual sites, life-size statues, and evidence of organized labor at massive scale. It thrived for something like 1,500 years. And then, in one of the strangest details of the entire story, it deliberately buried itself. Before we get to the burial, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through the pillars, the pattern across a dozen sites, and the fact that an entire prehistoric culture was operating in southeastern Turkey before the timeline said it should have been possible, you're the kind of person who wants a story built on what the evidence actually shows, not what the tidy version of history prefers to remember. That's exactly what this channel exists to make, and we put out something like this every single day. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means the next one just shows up. Now back to the strangest detail of the entire Göbekli Tepe story, because the site did not simply fall out of use, or get abandoned, or slowly get forgotten the way most ancient sites eventually do. Its own builders deliberately buried it. Around 8000 BC, roughly 1,500 years after construction began, the people who had been maintaining Göbekli Tepe made a collective decision that has puzzled archaeologists for as long as they've been trying to understand it. They stopped using the site. They filled every enclosure, every pillar, every carved surface with tons of deliberately transported soil, gravel, animal bones, and stone rubble. They packed it in carefully, layer by layer, until the pillars that had stood exposed for centuries were completely covered. They then walked away, and as far as we can tell, never returned. Ancient sites decay. That is the normal course of history. Buildings fall down, get looted for stone, get slowly reclaimed by soil and vegetation, and eventually get forgotten. Göbekli Tepe did not decay. It was buried, intentionally, by its own community in what appears to have been an organized ceremonial closure of the entire site. Think about what that actually required. Enclosure D alone, one of some 20 enclosures on the hill, is filled with an estimated 300 to 500 cubic meters of deliberately transported backfill. Multiply that across every enclosure on the site. You are looking at another massive coordinated labor project, comparable in scale to the original construction, undertaken specifically for the purpose of sealing away something the builders had spent 1,500 years maintaining. Nobody knows why. That is the honest answer, and it is worth stating clearly, because a lot of speculation about Göbekli Tepe fills that particular vacuum with theories that outrun the evidence. What we have is the fact of the burial. What we don't have is the reason. Some archaeologists have argued for a symbolic interpretation, that the enclosures had life cycles, birth when they were built, life while they were in use, and death when they were deliberately entombed. Under this reading, the burial wasn't destruction. It was a kind of funeral for the architecture itself, a way of formally ending the sacred function of a space rather than letting it decline naturally. Others have suggested more practical explanations, that the burial was a form of preservation, a deliberate time capsule intended to protect the site from erosion, weathering, or the disturbances that would inevitably occur as the surrounding landscape changed. Under this reading, the builders knew their monuments couldn't stand exposed forever and chose to preserve them the only way they could, by sealing them off from the outside world entirely. Still others have argued for a cultural shift, that by 8000 BC, the world the builders inhabited had changed enough that the beliefs Göbekli Tepe had been designed around no longer held. Agriculture was now widespread. Permanent villages had emerged across the region. The kind of communal gathering that Göbekli Tepe existed to facilitate may have been made obsolete by new forms of social organization tied to farming and settlement. And the burial may have been a formal acknowledgement that a certain way of being human had come to an end. We don't know which of these is right. It's possible more than one is right. It's possible none of them are. What is certain is that the people who buried Göbekli Tepe knew exactly what they were doing, that the act of burial was as coordinated and deliberate as the original construction, and that whatever cultural or spiritual weight the site carried was significant enough to warrant a ceremonial ending on the same scale as its creation. And here is the last piece of the story worth carrying with you, because it makes the whole picture stranger than any single detail on its own. The burial worked. Göbekli Tepe stayed hidden for 10,000 years. It sat under that soil, undisturbed, through the rise of every civilization we now consider ancient. Egypt rose and fell above it. Sumer, Babylon, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the modern Turkish state, all of them in turn walked across the top of that hill without ever suspecting what was beneath their feet. Which means for the entire length of recorded human history, the actual beginning of that history was sitting quietly underground, waiting for us to notice. So here's where all of this actually leaves you. You came into this video with a story about civilization that most people carry without ever questioning it. A tidy progression from cave to farm to village to city, agriculture as the first step, monuments as a much later achievement, primitive hunter-gatherers gradually becoming use over thousands of patient years. Göbekli Tepe does not fit into that story, not because it is a fringe theory or an outlier or a misinterpretation of the evidence. It doesn't fit because the story is wrong and has been wrong for at least a century, and the archaeological establishment has spent the past 30 years quietly acknowledging that fact while textbooks catch up. You now know the first monumental architecture our species ever built was constructed by people who had not yet invented farming. You know it required coordinated labor at scales that supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers were not capable of organizing. You know it was not a single anomalous site, but the most visible example of a broader culture operating across southeastern Turkey 12,000 years ago, leaving behind stone pillars, life-size human sculptures, and ritual chambers that predate every civilization you learned about in school by thousands of years. You know that agriculture, the thing that was supposed to have caused everything else, appears in this exact region shortly after Göbekli Tepe begins to be built, on a mountain visible from the hilltop itself. The wheat that would eventually feed most of humanity was first domesticated within sight of the pillars. So were cattle. So were the first pigs and sheep. Whatever was happening at Göbekli Tepe, it happened before farming. And farming appears to have emerged in the immediate vicinity of it, at roughly the pace you would expect if the site was somehow driving the process rather than the other way around. And you know that the builders themselves, after 1,500 years of maintaining and expanding what they had made, decided together to bury it. Every enclosure filled deliberately, every pillar covered, the entire hill sealed away with the same coordinated labor that had built it in the first place. And then for 10,000 years, nobody knew. Egypt happened above it. Every empire you can name happened above it. Every history book written by every ancient historian, every account of how civilization began, every confident chart in every classroom, all of it happened while the actual answer sat quietly underground, waiting for someone to dig. Here's the part worth sitting with, more than any single detail of the site itself. The version of our own history that we carry around in our heads is not, and has never been, complete. It is a working draft. It is what we know so far, filtered through the assumptions of whoever taught it to us, based on the evidence available at the time they were writing. Göbekli Tepe did not exist, as far as archaeology was concerned, before 1994. Now it does, and the entire timeline of human civilization has had to shift to accommodate it. There is no reason to believe this is the last time that will happen. 90% of Göbekli Tepe is still under the ground. The wider Taştepeler culture across southeastern Turkey has barely been surveyed. There are other sites, on other hills in other regions of the world, that nobody has thought to look at yet. Every one of them might be sitting on top of something that will rewrite what we currently think we know. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitives. They were not us. They were something else, a version of humanity that thought monumentally, gathered communally, created art we can still recognize as art, and organized themselves at scales we didn't think they were capable of. They lived, they built, they buried what they had built, and they vanished into a silence that lasted longer than every civilization since combined. We are their inheritors. We just didn't know it until very recently. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day, the version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what civilization, what forgotten site, what quiet piece of hidden history you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.